Welcome back to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast, where we explore God at work in Canadian cities. Today, I'm privileged to have Charles Hermelink with me as my guest. Charles and I have had many great conversations, actually all across the country. And today, we have the advantage of recording a conversation finally. So welcome, Charles. It's good to have you on.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so for our listeners, Charles and I both work together with Mission Canada, a Christian mission agency to reach Canada with the gospel in unique ways. There are many contexts where there is a gap, campuses, people groups, regions, communities where Jesus is inadequately represented, and Mission Canada is committed to identify and equip those who will pursue their calling to fill these gaps. Who knows, maybe there's even listeners to the podcast that something's going to stick and they're going to be giving us a call, Charles, and saying, hey, I think maybe I need to have a conversation with you guys. At least that's our hope. Yeah. So I'm the urban ministry consultant with Mission Canada, and Charles is the Cultural Ministries consultant. And as part of that role, he gives leadership to Neighbours and Newcomers Network National. He'll tell us a bit about that. So for anybody that doesn't know you, Charles, maybe we can go all the way back to Kansas City. I noticed on your Facebook profile, it says you're from Kansas City. So I don't know if you're one of the Kansas City prophets or not, but good to have you on. And let's hear a little bit about your origins. And you've had a global journey through your life. So let's go back to your early years and start there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, today I have a dual citizenship between both US and Canada, just like our kids do. But yeah, it started back in Kansas City, and I was born there, lived there 3 times, lived in Chicago 3 times, Minneapolis twice, and a few other cities and states in between. So much so that one of the churches we attended actually called us the semi-nomadic Hermelink clan. So my father's career was in advertising, creative advertising, the visual commercial arts, and he did very well. And every couple of years, an agency would see his work and hire him. And so, with growing responsibility and an accompanying salary, of course, we'd often move. So in the U.S., they often will refer to kids whose parents grew up in the U.S. Military service as Army brats. I've always referred to myself as an ad brat, moving every couple of years because of advertising there. Yeah, so that's where it all started.
And so your journey to faith, and at some point you began to sense a call to ministry work full time. Talk a bit about your walk to Jesus.
Well, we were back in Kansas City for the second time in my life, and it was during that time I completed high school there. When I was in grade 9, our independent Pentecostal church actually started a private Christian school. And so for that 1 year, I went to that Christian school. We had weekly chapel services. In a chapel service, I was filled with spirit and with a sense of calling to ministry. But I was a good Jonah, if I could say that. I don't know if there's really such a good Jonah or a bad Jonah. That's another theological conversation. But I didn't run from God or the church or any of that, but I ran from that sort of undefined sense of a call to ministry. So in high school, after high school, I started academically going down the road of pursuing a degree in international marketing. So here, this was my question for you, Kevin. Kevin, if you had to take international marketing and plunk it down in the kingdom of God, what would you call it? What would it be?
I would probably call that global missions.
That's right. It's global missions. So in the middle of my academic studies, God again picked up our family. We moved from Chicagoland at this point, to back to Minneapolis, and so second time in Chicago, and then off to Minneapolis we went. And there, I didn't even go to Bible college there either. It was interesting to me when I reflect on it. In Chicago, there isn't a Pentecostal or POC, Assemblies of God uh, Bible college or university or anything. So God picks our family up, moves us to Minneapolis, and in almost the whole first year, I just was working in telemarketing, actually, to businessmen and women back in the earliest days of mobile phones. Back
Wow.
when your mobile phone had to be installed in your car because it had to be hooked up to your car battery. It was all this equipment,
Those
and it
big
was terribly
boxes.
expensive. Oh,
Yeah.
it was horrible. So after almost a year of that and still sensing God's calling to ministry, one day I drove myself down to what was then North Central Bible College. Now it's North Central University in downtown Minneapolis to enroll. And they asked me, they said, well, what major do you want to declare? And I said, honestly, Kevin, I had no clue. I'm just, blindly trying to follow this sense of calling. And so I said, well, what have you got? What majors do you offer? And they slid this little single sheet of paper, probably about 4 items on it. And it was just so glaringly obvious to me that it was mission. Yeah. So that's how it all started.
And I've met Connie, and you guys have had a good run together. So how'd she come into your story?
Yeah, we celebrate 34 years together this year in just a couple of months. And we met at North Central. She was one of the Canadian students had come down because um, North Central was offering 4-year degrees and the context is at that time, the POC was only offering 3-year degrees at their Bible colleges or institutions. And Shix had already had one college degree already in travel. So we're perhaps similar in that she's feeling a call to missions and goes and gets a degree in travel, and I'm headed for international marketing, right? And then responds to a call of God. They went down. The other reason that Canadian students were coming to North Central is that Don Argy was president at that time, attachment to the Argy family, the Pentecostal assemblies, links there for us in Canada, and they were offering Canadian dollars at par with American dollars,
Ooh.
so that was not a disincentive to Canadian students at all. And that is, like it is now, a huge difference, in those international rates. And so she was one of those, and I was more than a year ahead of her in the mission program, and it was actually a mutual friend, another student in the mission program, that introduced the two of us. And so, yeah, that's where that all started.
So if you hadn't have married Connie, do you think you would have even ended up in Canada? Like, was it family that initially drew you up this way?
Yeah, it really was. I probably never would have ended up in Canada. And so you just trust that this is part of God's will and God's path and God's agenda for
Hmm.
for us, and what he wants in his kingdom.
So let's do the short bio version of where you and Connie went in ministry and places you lived up until where you are now.
So we went through. I was actually in a sub program stream, special stream of the missions program at North Central, and it was about sending workers fresh out of training with the latest in missionary strategy, and but also at reduced budgets, right, to make it easier to get first time workers off the field. Basically, those who had set this up, Jerry Fowley and others who had set this up, were saying, look, we lose too many Bible college grads from our mission programs in that stage where, okay, you graduate, you got to go to a church, you have to be in ministry for a couple of years, get fully ordained, now you apply, and then you go. And what happens is life happens to people, right? They get married, they get a mortgage, and all of this, and they don't end up going to the field. So there's a huge attrition rate. So this program was about getting people directly from Bible college onto the field. And it was actually wildly successful. And unfortunately, it was so successful it killed itself. Missionaries on the field were a tad intimidated by the results, and people were questioning that. So right when we were graduating, the program ended, and we weren't able to go to the field through that. Then we were applying, and we were going to go through another program with the Assemblies of God missionary training, and we were approved to go to Jordan, and then the first Gulf War broke out. So before we were released, they said, hold on, and everything kind of came to a screeching halt. And so we didn't end up going. We did end up going through that traditional route. Okay, get a job at a church, get fully ordained, all of that. And we did that. We didn't have the mortgage, but we had kids. And so it was at that point that Connie had said she'd been living outside of Canada for almost 10 years. We had two boys, now about 4 and 6. They have dual citizenship. And her words to me roughly were, before we move overseas and never come back, can we live in Canada for just a bit? So the context for that is the year prior, we had sent out over 100 letters and resumes to the states and districts across the United States where we had family and friends: California, Arizona, Texas, Michigan, and New York. And we received no responses. We got nothing.
Yikes.
Right? So it's one of those kind of things you go, God, I thought you told me to do this, and you get nothing. Well, we still believe he told us to do that, and it was all to set us up for what was coming next. So when she asked me that question, we were standing on the driveway, and I gave what I thought was a safe answer, and it was a snap decision, which, as you and I have learned in life, often prove very dangerous. And I said to her, I will look in my area of ministry, which is not music and not youth, which is really adult ministries, then probably a larger church. I'm thinking I'm narrowing this field down, right? Okay, geographically, only in the Golden Horseshoe, just from Toronto to Niagara, where she's from, only for 6 months. I put all these limitations in there, thinking I'm safe, right? And well, my resume went to the Western Ontario District, had an interview with David Shepherd. David Shepherd gave my resume to some place called KRT I'd never heard of, some place called Brampton I'd never heard of. And Peter McIntosh was newly installed as senior pastor and in woeful need of staff, and hired me as an assistant. And we moved to Canada, all in less than 4 months. So that whole previous experience of sending 100 letters was context for, gee, I think God wants you here.
It would sound like it, yeah.
Yeah.
And
so then we were at
fact
KRT
that
for 10 years. Sorry, we were at KRT for 10 years. Then we left KRT. We were actually with International Missions, now Missions Global, and a new initiative called CMO, the Center for Muslim Outreach, which was about mobilizing workers to closed Muslim majority nations. The CMO later grew into the entire RAN division. We also mobilized by the Lord to Southeast Asia. And we
yes.
were doing the same thing. We were mobilizing workers into the Southeast Asian mission
So
field.
just to give some context for anybody that's listening and not familiar, um, Mission Global and Mission Canada and RAN, which stands for Restricted Access Nations. Those are three branches of mission within the context of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. And when you had the 100 resume flop, And then the next thing was talking to David Shepherd. I'm not surprised that God was in it. Dave Shepherd, how has Dave Shepherd impacted your life?
It was great. Obviously I had no idea who David Shepherd was, and just it was a thing of I sent my resume to the district, but then have that prompting from the Holy Spirit. You need to go, have an interview. So
Mhm.
I called up, scheduled an interview, drove up, had an interview with him, or organized it. I think it was early, like on a Monday morning. And so I stayed with Connie's parents here in Niagara, drove over to the district office in Burlington, had my meeting with him. And it's in that very personal face to face that he says, you know what, there is a church near here that is looking for someone. And so that's just how the spirit works, right? He gives promptings in our lives, and he also works through relationships, right? Face to
That's
face
right.
meetings and encountering people and talking and exploring together what is the will of God. Yeah. So David,
Yeah.
David was great. Then he was my district superintendent, and I've always enjoyed a good relationship. And of course, he's married to a Connie too.
Mhm. There's a sign. Yeah. So, and then was it after that that you were off? You were with the Muslim organization, and then did that also was that before Thailand?
So yeah, when we were about 2.5 years with CMO, Center for Muslim Outreach, working mobilizing workers in Canada to go to Muslim countries. Then our kids basically came to the point of saying, "Yeah, we want to go to the mission field as well," which again was unusual because of their mid to late teen ages. A lot of agencies will not send people when their kids are that age. But our kids actually popped up and said, no, 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 we want to go. And so we all went, and we were based initially in Thailand, just because that's where the region is based out of. Regional office works out of Thailand. My work was in all the countries of Southeast Asia region, and working with not only placing new workers in those countries, but also then working with the national church to begin to reach their Muslim neighbors.
Then you come back to Canada again, and I believe after Thailand.
We
Yeah.
did. We were in the middle of coming down to the end. We were not even 45 days from the end of our term. I was finishing some academic studies, which was preparatory for things in Indonesia. We were wrapping up our household, everything. We had a place located in Indonesia. We had language schools set up. I had a job set up because really you need a work visa to really kind of live and be there. All of that, and then we got a call that there was an extended family uh, critical illness, and
Hmm.
so Connie actually left in less than 24 hours, went home to help the family with this, and my younger son, Carl, was still with us. We stayed for the next 45 days, finished wrapping everything up, put everything in storage, and came back to Canada. And because of the context of that family situation, we knew we're not going back to the field right now. And that's when I started working with Mission Canada.
It's interesting in hearing the trajectory of places and decisions that you had to make. And more than once, I heard you describing situations where it came unexpectedly, uh, where you didn't even really have a direction, and then you did. All the way that the Holy Spirit often leads, and when we think about the role that you have now in working with cultural language groups in Canada. There's often this unexpected movement of people, and that's what the story of newcomers and immigration or refugee claimants is about, is these diasporas, these massive movements of people from one part of the world to a completely different context. uh
Mm.
what how talk a little bit about that diaspora, and how is God at work in our world today?
Yeah. You started there with the unexpected that happens in our lives, and made me reflect again the idea of sometimes we draw it out. We think, well, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a single straight line, right? And so
Hmm.
this is the trajectory I'm going to map. We want a nice line, a smooth curve, that sort of thing. And yet reality is our map is scrolling all over, our journey is scrolling all over the place. It's this complicated line. God is the one who sees and knows the whole journey. We don't, right? Yet God takes us through all of those things, what we term good and bad, to prepare us for all the things he has yet for us on that path, on that wandering journey there, right? And so coming back and then working with Mission Canada, essentially then starting with Mission Canada, this emphasis, like CMO did, Center for Muslim Outreach did, that was about mobilizing Canadian workers to go to Muslim fields. But the reality is Muslims are also coming to Canada, right? And so there's directly that context of, okay, we need to begin to equip the church to reach Muslims, and we need to begin to mobilize workers to Canada as well, because diaspora simply means, you're we're talking about peoples from somewhere else, you know, and that's just a really, I often say, from the beginning of time, since Adam and Eve were shoved out of the garden, man has been moving across the face of the earth. One of my favorite missions verses is often not recognized as a mission verse. It's actually, I think it's Acts 17, 26, 27. We love this passage because Paul at the Areopagus, and and preaching, to them and saying, "I come to declare to you, the unknown God." In the middle of that, what he says there, he actually gives us a window into the kingdom that is very unique, because it says that since the beginning of time, man has been moving across the face of the earth, so that there is a purpose in this movement of peoples across the earth, so that they will perhaps seek him, so that they will seek him and perhaps find him, even though he is not far from any one of us. And we begin to reflect on that. We begin to realize God is behind immigration.
Mm.
God is in charge of history. God is in charge of the movement of peoples. People are continuing to move across the face of the earth, and he has a purpose. God is bringing immigrants to Canada to hear the gospel, because
Yeah.
immigrants at that stage, when you're an immigrant, like I have had official residence in 3 countries of the world, I know what it's like to move long term, move with a sense of permanence. Everything in your life is upset. All your systems, there's nothing that is not upset. You are actually the most open to the gospel at that point. That's why God uses immigration to make people become open to the gospel. That's what it's about. It's about sharing the gospel.
Yeah, and often it's human caused calamity that causes those movements too. And God sees the oppression, God sees the wars, He sees the famines and the lack of food distribution. He can use all kinds of things problems that we humans cause.
That's
And
right.
yeah, so
He
when
doesn't
I
cause them, but he
mhm,
uses them, right?
right, right.
Let let no good pandemic or disaster go to waste. God has a purpose for it in the kingdom.
Amen.
Redemptive.
Amen. I believe that. I really do. So when if I were a business person moving to a foreign country, let's say I was moving to I was going to work in China. I know people that have, and
Mhm,
chances are, if I was going to be there for a couple years or more doing business, I would be looking for an international church. I would be looking for a group of other Christians that speak English so that
mhm,
I can have that sense of home and
mhm,
worship in my own language. And when somebody from another language speaking country comes to Canada and they're a Christian, it's often the same thing, right? They'll come and seek out a church in their language group, or they'll come, and if they're a pastor, they'll plant a church in their language group. And that model of language group church certainly meets an immediate need. But what happens to those churches over time, Charles?
mhm. It's an interesting journey for people. I've talked to people from all kinds of cultural backgrounds and at all different stages in the process. We often refer to them as 1.0, 1.5, 2.0, 3.0, right? 1.0 are adults who come. They're the immigrant, right? Like I'm an immigrant, okay? A lot of people, we look at people and we make all kinds of gross and erroneous assumptions about people. So people look at me and they don't think I'm an immigrant. Well, I'm an immigrant.
Yeah.
And, there are distinct cultural differences between the United States and Canada, right? And all the Canadians say, yeah, there are. And so I actually use that with that in my even in my own background to make people aware of some of those presumptions and then try and overcome them in that.
So you'd be the
1.5,
one, you're the 1.0.
I'm a 1.0. My
Yeah.
kids are really 1.5s
Mhm.
because a 1.5 is somebody who came with their adult parent or grandparent or guardian, but they themselves were typically, preteen when they came. So they have some knowledge and some background from their original home culture, but they've landed early in their life in the Canadian culture, right? 2.0s are those who were born here. 3.0 obviously is the next generation after that. And so there are trends that cultural language churches go through. So, like you said, Kevin, if I went as a businessman to China, I would look for an English language church, especially until perhaps I spoke Chinese well enough to go to a Chinese church, right? So we went to a bilingual church, two different bilingual churches in Bangkok. I had an English language church in Indonesia, that in Jakarta, that I went to, right? While we were there. So it's natural for somebody to come to Canada and they're going to look for a cultural language church. So they provide a very, very important role in people's lives, Christian and those who are not yet Christian, because those not yet Christian but are immigrants are looking for other people that share their background, share their language, share their food, all of those kinds of. You want something that's familiar to you in the midst of, this new culture that you've landed in. However, 1.5s and 2.0s will very quickly start to undergo a change, right? They've grown up in this cultural context of Canada. While they may speak their mother tongue, their parents' mother tongue, and they understand that culture, it's natural for them, they also grew up in this culture, French or English or uh, maybe even Aboriginal, depending on where they settled, and they have acculturated to that. Now they want that. We walked through this and watched it walk through this in Connie's home church here in St. Catharines. She grew
Mhm.
up in what was a German branch PAOC church, Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada Church, here in St. Catharines. So it went from German language Pentecostal worship services to German with English translation, then English with German translation. Until today, it no longer has German translation. I think they still have once a week a German language Bible study for those who are want to still function, in that, still facilitate that. But they're fully, you go to that church now, you wouldn't know that. You would just realize this is a English language
What would
church.
you
So
what would you say in a cultural language church in another culture, uh, the um, the effectiveness of evangelism to their own language group? When How long does it take before a German Pentecostal church no longer has a focus on reaching Germans?
this is a great missiological question, and it's something I dealt with actually, when I was in Thailand or in Indonesia or other countries that I worked with, because they would talk about, oh, we've sent a missionary and a mission team to, let's say, Berlin. And it was like, oh, okay, that's great. Who are you reaching? Well, we're reaching Indonesian speakers, in Berlin, Thai speakers in Toronto or something like this, right? And I say, okay, it's not actually missions. That's just evangelism. You just happen to be doing evangelism in a different country, in a different majority language group, right? Missions is cross-cultural evangelism. It's when you have to do evangelism, but now I have to include language, significant cultural difference, significant religious difference, social practices. It's all so different that I have to think about, how do I communicate the gospel in such a way that it makes sense in them? Are they understanding what I'm saying, right?
Right.
And so put that in the context in which we're in now. Let's say Nigerians come here. Okay, let's be more specific. Let's say somebody who speaks Igbo comes here from Nigeria, okay? And they want to, they're running Pentecostal services in Igbo, right? And so great, and they're going to have a natural evangelistic connection because of language and culture, because of that language and that same similar background. All those cultural language churches, however, will eventually have to begin reaching beyond Igbo speakers in Toronto, because there are only so many Igbo speakers, right?
Right.
And not only that, it's not just that, but it's also God and the gospel itself is calling us to more than just reaching our own language. You're called to reach all peoples who are around you, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it doesn't matter whether we're an English language or a French language or an Aboriginal language majority church, we still, or some other international language church, we still have to reach cross-culturally, cross-linguistically to people who are around.
That's really embedded into Acts 1:8, the Great Commission, isn't it? That you start, Jesus said to the disciples, You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem." That was hometown, that was their language, that was their
Mhm.
people. That's where you start.
Right?
Jerusalem,
Culturally similar. Mhm.
Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the earth. And so as you go further away from Jerusalem to Judea, that's your region, but the
Mhm.
people are still very much like you in your region,
Mhm.
shared culture often. But then what about Samaria and uttermost parts of the earth? Now, we always thought that missions was getting on a plane and crossing the ocean to another place. But uh, in in our context of Mission Canada, we're recognizing, wait a second, all the nations of the world come to Canada. So maybe talk a little bit about our context and what how as a world traveler, Charles, how unique is Canada in the nations of the world when it comes to immigration, when it comes to coexistent cultures?
We really are. In the beginning, Kevin, you said Mission Canada is about the gaps, the places, and I ask people this, what's a gap? Well, a gap is where you're not, right? It's, and we need to be in fill these gaps. So that's why Mission Canada is organized around these 5 priorities. You lead one, urban, and I lead one, which is cultural language groups. And that's the very cross-cultural, which is naturally, Kevin and I, you and I have this great crossover between our priorities because our cities are the ones, our urban environments are the ones that are extremely multicultural, right? Used to be said 100 to 200 years ago in missions, you're a missionary when you cross water. And that was because there was before planes. To be a missionary, you had to get on a boat, go somewhere, you had to cross water, right? Well, today it's entirely different. Not that you have to get on an airplane, it's that they got on boats and airplanes that came here, right? They came across the border, or maybe a boat or an airplane to the United States, and then they crossed the border into Canada, like I did, drive across, and that. And so the mission field is landed here. And this is the gap, coming back to the idea of gaps that from Acts 1:8 that you're talking about there, Jesus has identified. We get Jerusalem because it is the city where we live. It is the people who are like us. They are physically close to us. So they're culturally close to us. They're physically close to us. We often think of missions as the uttermost parts of the earth, the end of the phrase, right? But what about the gap in the middle? Like you said, Judea and Samaria. It's a combination there. Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. Judea, like you said, here we are in Ontario. We would say, well, other Ontarians, right? People who are they're perhaps like us, but they're not quite as close. But they're in our state, they're in our province, they're in our area. But it's them and Samaritans. Well, who are Samaritans? Well, they're also somewhat close, but they're very culturally different. That's the uttermost parts who've come to live among us, right? And so, how we are as our multiculturalism. You asked the question. Maybe it was in text rather than I don't know if you said it or not. How much do we differ from our neighbors to the south, right? It's often quoted that Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world, and it might be true. It probably is. A lot of cities are like that today. We're extremely diverse, and that more and more so. It's more apparent here in Canada than in America because they have 10 times the population, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the number of people coming in doesn't have the same level of marked visible change. But there's some other things that are going on too. Spanish is the dominant second language of the United States. In fact, it's predicted in the next 27 years, it could be that by 2050, Spanish will surpass English as the number 1 spoken language in the United States. Now, there's other factors that might dent that, might be further off, I don't know. However, the point is this: 75% of people in Canada speak English at home. 21.5% speak French at home. 18% are bilingual between the two, French and English. But 25% of Canadian households are speaking other languages, 12.5% of those all the time, always speaking another language. Well, what are those? Actually, the big two top languages of all of those in Canada are Mandarin, Chinese, and Punjabi from India, right? And each of those is more than 500,000, right? Now, then, if we're talking about Indigenous populations here, Cree and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, Inuktitut, okay, are the primary languages that are spoken there. So all of this goes up to say that the complexion and the complexity of Canadian multiculturalism is very different than that of the United States. So sometimes that's why we look at resources or speakers or books or materials and stuff coming out of the States about multiculturalism doesn't always translate as well to the Canadian context because our context is quite different.
So, talk to me a bit about what Mission Canada is doing. Tell me about some of our workers that are um, doing mission. They're on mission to people of other language groups in Canada.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. At the beginning, you mentioned an identity that we have within Mission Canada called NNN, or Neighbours Newcomers Network. It's really our 3L, three-letter RAN, Restricted Access Nation Style designation for those who are working in communities with significant Muslim populations, typically, and that worker needs their identity and reputation online, mostly about media and online, to be more secure. So we have several of those operating in cities across the country, but we don't talk about them in a context like this. We do have others like uh, J.P. Gopalan, who is originally from India, actually originally from a Hindu background, convert to Christ, and he was a successful church planter, cross-cultural worker in India. And God leaves him to Canada and ends up, he works in Toronto and Scarborough area. He is a spirit-filled, spirit-led, cross-cultural evangelist. I often call him the equal opportunity evangelist. It doesn't matter what your background is. JP will share the
That's
gospel with you.
JP.
And he
Yeah.
comes with great stories all the time of people getting saved and getting filled with the Spirit, getting delivered, getting healed, like just fantastic stuff. Joseph Bagaza is another one of those. Joseph joined us this year. He's originally from Central Africa, works in Winnipeg, and he's on the streets and he's in the airport, and he is connecting and meeting with other newcomers as they arrive and land and sharing the gospel with them. He is connecting them with our POC churches in the city of Winnipeg. He is serving their needs and just seeing people come to faith all the time. Both of them are just full of exciting stories always. I love talking to them because of that.
There's security concerns for Christians in other nations. Uh, if they're in a nation that is hostile to Christianity, that's
Mhm.
our RAN, our RAN mission agency that uh, works in confidentiality to help put people in difficult environments. But you mentioned with the neighbor and newcomer network that there's a parallel there. So is it risky for workers in Canada to reach Muslims? What kind of
I
risks?
appreciate that you've asked this question, Kevin. A number of years ago, when there was, attacks in Western countries were more frequent and things like that, there was a great level of concern. So I did a study. I surveyed other mission agencies across Canada and a few in the US as well that I have connections with, and asked them, for your office and for your workers in Canada. So these are denominational and then other mission agencies. No mission agency or no worker in North America has ever faced those kinds of personal or direct attacks, right? It's
Hmm.
significant to mention that. Now, that's not to say that it'll never happen. However, what it does address is the illusory fear. It's an illusion. Fear is often an illusion
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
oh, we can't say it, we can't do it. No, that's not actually true, right? I have been in hostile areas of the world, in Muslim areas. I have slept in Muslims' homes. I have eaten with them in their homes, on their patios, in their restaurants, and never felt threatened by them at all. And in fact, great hospitality. I have a great story. One time, actually, they were protecting me from the national police in the country, right? And it was safer to be with the Muslims than anywhere else. So a lot of that is very illusory. You know, it's not really
Mhm.
true. It's a trick of the enemy
Mhm.
of our
Yeah,
mind to say,
yeah,
oh, shouldn't do or say anything there,
yeah. It
right?
can freeze us up from doing anything or
Yeah,
saying anything. Yeah,
yeah. The love and the truth set us free. This
yeah,
is the spirit. The love and the truth set us free. Yeah.
yeah. Uh, when uh, when we talk about Muslims in Canada, yeah, what kind of numbers are we looking at?
So sometimes it's hard to track numbers. Sometimes it is a little bit of some sleuthing, especially because the government of Canada changed how they do the census a few years ago. They don't track religious identities. So we have to do a little bit of sleuthing through language groups, none of which are always a solid majority of one religious identity or another. And so some of that numbers float around all the time. Excuse me. Is that number under a million? Is it over a million? Is it 1.5 million? One of the things I would say is that having done lots of demographic research for Muslims in Canada, one of the things you begin to realize is that demographics, large scale demographics, don't change really fast. And so, and so sometimes what people do is they will take a number, this many, you know, this is the percentage of Muslims today, and if we multiply this out, and if we take a multiplying birth rate, you know, all these, and they'll come out with some really explosive and inflammatory numbers, you know,
Yeah,
predictions,
yeah.
but they're false because we're talking about 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, the other generations. Even as Muslims move here, they fall in line with our birth rates as well. They don't
Hmm. Hmm.
maintain those birth rates that they have from their home countries and stuff like that. So it's not that you know, it's an illusion that Muslims are going to take over Canada. No, they're not going
Yeah,
to take over
yeah,
Canada, right?
yeah.
These again are fears that the enemy is using, and
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
lies and half truths, right? What's our response? Well, truth and love, right?
Hmm.
And we don't have to be afraid of Muslims. What we really need to do is reach out and love them and engage them, right? Because
Right,
that
right.
is actually what they need. The more we love and engage Muslims, the more, you know, if you want to use the term de-radicalized, actually
Hmm.
that is what leads to de-radicalization.
Love is the great de-radicalizer, the love of
It
God.
is.
Yeah.
It gives us a new radicalism. I'm radically in love with Jesus, not with some other violent, you know, identity. Yeah.
Um, got one more question for you today, and that's around just the whole idea that the global church is a macro version of the body of Christ, just
Hmm.
as the local church is a micro version of the body of Christ, or even if two or three of us gather together, you know. So but when we think about the what is it that when Christians from other nations come to Canada, what are some of the spiritual gifts you think that we can receive from the from Christians that come here from all other parts of the world? Because I think historically we were probably you know, kind of a bit presumptive to think that you know, Christianity revolved around you know, Western civilization and the English language, you know, especially
Hmm.
the King James
Right.
version, right?
Yeah.
um, but in our presumption of a, you know, Westocentric um, faith, uh, people from other parts of the world coming here that walk with Jesus, there's something of a gift there that we need to receive. Do you want to talk a bit about what you see coming
Yeah.
through Christians from other parts of the world that we in Canada and the U.S. And really need to receive the gifts that are coming?
Hmm. Hmm. You know, in one sense, we use the term spiritual gifts. Well, you know, on one hand, yeah, there's one spirit, one baptism, one salvation, one Lord and God of all, right?
Hmm.
There's one, there's one source for all these spiritual gifts. But I like how it says in Ephesians 4, 11 and 12, and then from there, God gives gifts to the church. And then he talks about what we often talk about the fivefold, apostles and prophets, as well as then evangelists, teachers, and pastors, right? People are gifts. They are
Hmm.
gifts in and
Hmm.
of themselves. And that's the sense of spiritual gift that newcomers to Canada, immigrants to Canada, especially Pentecostals who, other believers who come and they're looking. This is a wonderful aspect post pandemic that we're seeing right now. It's like there's 2 years or roughly of pent up demand, right? People have not
Right.
been able to go to church. You know, people are coming into Canada. You know, they're looking for something, and I have churches that are calling me, and in fact, I got one referred to me yesterday. We're having a conversation next week, and not all of these are even in urban centers. Some of them are in unusual places where they are encountering all of a sudden one of them said to me, before the pandemic we were white, and after the pandemic suddenly we are multicultural. What do we do? And so great problems to have, and others are kind of waking up and saying we need to be intentional in this way. David Wells will often talk about the dynamic that we've been undergoing, and I saw this when we were at Kennedy Road Tabernacle in Brampton, KRT, in the almost 10 years that we were there, because it was the same thing. We showed up and they were majority white, right? And today it is minority, absolute minority white at KRT. Wonderful diversity. It was 63 birth nations when I left. I can't imagine what it is now, right? And I was back there speaking some months ago. It was wonderful to be there and see that. We have become unintentionally multicultural. Unintentionally, because it wasn't our intention. KRT just underwent the transformation that Brampton was undergoing, right?
Hmm.
The goal, however, that David Wells has often referred to as well, is we need to be intentionally intercultural. And because multicultural is descriptive, it's a description of what I see, what is,
Hmm.
and it's unintentional. Intentional intercultural is something entirely different, which is I'm gonna make my way with intentional steps toward not just staying within my cultural comfort zone, which even has to do with how I conduct, if I'm a leader in church, how I conduct my ministry. I'm going to intentionally be intercultural. I want to involve their cultural expressions into everything that we are doing. This is very rare in churches, but we're beginning to see more and more of it. And when churches do this, Kevin, churches really see some extraordinary things begin to happen. And it's really the next step of where the Spirit is leading us. We went through the worship wars, which had to do with generational change in expression of worship. Now we're going to the next level, which is even more dynamic and it's wonderful, which is an intentionality of involving all the cultures of the world in our worship. Now that's music and not music, right? Because worship is much
Hmm.
more than just musicality, right? And that. So some beautiful things that are happening here. Immigrants bring a freshness, a dynamism. I've always loved the worship experiences when I've been in Africa, when I've been in the Middle East, when I have been in various countries in Southeast Asia. It doesn't matter. there's something dynamic of experiencing someone else's worship, someone else's culture, worshiping God, and it just enlarges my experience, right? Our experience of worshiping God as well. So they're bringing something that we need. They're bringing something into our church if we will welcome it, encourage it, that is beautiful for them and beautiful for us too. And what it does is it's making us more into the image of heaven, because as
Mm,
we know,
mhm.
Revelation 5:9 and 7:9, especially 7, 9, and 10, is talking about this is what it's going to be like in heaven. Every language, every tribe, every people group, everybody's going to be represented there. And guess what? No matter what, jokes we've told, like my father-in-law, everybody in heaven will speak German, and us here now saying everybody in heaven's going to speak English, and everybody inserts their own language there. No, we're going to be speaking every language in heaven to worship God because He's worthy of all of
Yeah, I think there's something about when you are a majority culture, there's a certain security and confidence that comes with that. When you are a minority culture, there's a certain vulnerability and careful navigating that's required to find your way. And the path of following Jesus gives us both experiences. Love one another uh, is involves the fact that you need to love the other, and
that.
sometimes you are the other that someone else has to love. There's a real breaking down of all of our border distinctions, and I love that. Love that. Well, Charles, it's been helpful. It's been insightful talking with you today. And when it comes to what God can accomplish in Canada, the sky is the limit.
Amen.
Thank you for helping us think about the newcomer, helping us think about the high value of the body of Christ. And on the next episode, I've assembled a group of African pastors and others that minister in Canada. And we're going to explore the challenges and opportunities that African pastors face in adapting to Canadian culture. I've been thinking about how the Canadian church can learn so much from the African church and other churches of the world for that matter. So on our next episode, we're going to have a panel, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Join us again on Sidewalk Skyline Podcast, and until then, I'm your host, Kevin Rogers. Thank you for listening.